Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to tackle the issue of whether Ukraine belongs in the EU and should be allowed to join the organisation. Now, as many people may be aware, for the last several years there's been a lot of talk of Ukraine joining both the EU and NATO. We're not really going to talk about NATO today, we're going to focus on the EU aspect. Obviously, the president of Ukraine and the government there generally is very much in favour of EU membership. And as of June of this year, of 2024, the EU Council of Ministers actually initiated the process of accession discussions with both Ukraine and Moldova. Now, obviously, from the Ukrainian perspective, membership of the European Union is highly desirable, but that's not what I want to focus on today. I want to think about the benefit and the desirability of Ukraine joining the European Union from the perspective of the other European members, the other 27 members of the European Union, including, of course, Portugal. Would it benefit the Union as a whole to include Ukraine in the organisation? And my answer to that is very clear. No, I don't think that Ukraine belongs in the EU under current conditions anyway. There may be a path in many, many decades for Ukraine to join for sure, but in the near future, the next few years, absolutely not. I think it would be completely the wrong move, and I think there are several powerful reasons which push us towards the decision that Ukraine is not in any condition to join the EU at the moment, and its entry into the Union would be fundamentally harmful, and I will elaborate on them now. First of all, thinking about Ukraine, it's quite a big country. Pinning down the exact population of the country is a little bit difficult because it depends on, whether we say that this territory like the Donbass or Crimea is still part of Ukraine and whether the population is still classed as Ukrainian. And obviously we have to consider the refugee situation because there are millions of people who've been displaced to other EU countries or who have at least displaced themselves to other EU countries. But the estimate is around 38 million people. Now that would make Ukraine one of the EU's most populous nations. And, in the EU, it's not easy to get unanimity for decisions. We still have a lot of decisions which are made by unanimous votes. And if you have one country which is resisting, which has a different point of view. For example, Hungary has been traditionally one of those countries over the last decade or so, ever since Viktor Orban has become a major figure on the political scene there. Introducing Ukraine into the mix is probably going to cause similar problems because Ukraine as an economy is in a very, very different place from most of the other EU nations, especially the Western EU nations. And bringing a country of that size into the EU will cause further complications for reaching agreements, basically using the existing voting mechanism. So it would basically necessitate the switch to qualified majority voting. Which is what some countries support, but many of the smaller EU members don't want to do that because then they think they're going to lose their voice in the EU and their voice will just be subsumed under the influence of all the other larger countries. So I think we need to bear in mind when we're talking about adding a country like Ukraine to the EU, it is massive. There are many other candidate countries for the EU, but none of them have the same kind of scale, either in terms of territory or population, that Ukraine does. Secondly, I think enlarging the EU to include Ukraine would send the wrong message to candidate countries who have been waiting for a very long time. Ukraine has only become a very recent candidate country, basically since it was invaded, because this is, let's be honest, a very politically motivated decision to allow Ukraine to participate in accession talks, or Moldova. Neither of those countries were previously considered as being even close to the correct point to join the EU. And there are many other countries in the Western Balkans, for example, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia and Montenegro, just to name a few of them, that have been candidate countries for far, far longer than Ukraine. And many of these countries are well along the path to being integrated into the EU. Some of these countries have made phenomenal achievements in terms of tackling organised crime, strengthening the rule of law and institutions in their country, and reforming their economic models so that they will be admissible for EU membership. And they're still not there yet. And I really get the feeling that their membership has been put on the back burner for years and years and years. It must be very, very frustrating for the peoples and the governments there, because they are fundamentally, in Europe. I mean, some of them border Slovenia or Italy or Greece. They're very much in Europe. And yet they seem to be being leapfrogged. We're not hearing so much about their accession talks anymore. We're hearing much more about the prospects of Ukraine or Moldova joining the EU. It strikes me as being fundamentally just a bit unfair, because not only have these countries been undertaking the reforms which are necessary, whereas Ukraine really hasn't. They've been at it for far longer, and their economies are in far better shape than that of Ukraine. And frankly, they just deserve membership of the EU to a far greater extent than Ukraine does. The next major obstacle for Ukraine to join the EU is actually an article in the EU treaty, Article 42.7. This contains a mutual defence clause which obligates EU member countries to come to the defence of any other EU member country that is attacked. Now, obviously, in the case of Ukraine, or maybe some other countries like Moldova or Georgia that border on Russia, this could be a really big problem. Why hasn't it been a problem until now? Well, because EU member countries are all members of NATO, except Ireland, as far as I'm aware. And therefore it doesn't really matter, because they're covered by the NATO, American defense umbrella, basically. But if NATO does not expand, because it seems that NATO membership for Ukraine is less on the cards than EU membership seems to be. If it's just EU membership that the Ukrainians can receive, then this article of the EU treaty very much would be in play, and it would obligate the European Union to defend Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia if they join, against Russia potentially, or any other aggressor, but realistically against the Russian army. Now, this is really a big problem, because Moldova has a Russian Transnistria separatist region which wants to break away. Ukraine is currently being invaded by Russia on many fronts and has had territory annexed. And Georgia has the South Ossetia region, which has been invaded and occupied by Russian troops for many years, and the country is under threat of further Russian military intervention. So admitting any of these countries, on the Russian periphery into the EU, if they are not simultaneously admitted into NATO, creates a huge potential defence burden on the EU countries, because maybe in the event of an attack, we would be obligated to defend those countries against the Russian army, which has proven itself, if nothing else, to be a formidable fighting force. And I'm not sure that everybody who's talking about Ukraine joining the EU fully understands the depth of that commitment, because for me personally, I find that to be quite troubling and scary. As for the next reason why Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to join the EU, is because it doesn't have the characteristics of an EU country in terms of the strength of its institutions or its respect for basic EU values. For example, there's no real freedom of speech in Ukraine. People who voice opposition to government figures frequently meet problems, and that's not something that can really be tolerated in a country that wants to join the EU. Equally, corruption is famous in Ukraine. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's almost as corrupt as Russia or somewhere like Turkey or something like that. Corruption is a key measurement which is used to gauge whether a country is ready to join the EU family of countries. And Ukraine clearly fails on that measure. You have corruption up to the highest levels of government in the country. And just generally, the rule of law, the strength of institutions in Ukraine is weak. Legal enforcement is patchy, and nepotism is rife within the government, as well as corruption. It goes hand in hand with that. And right now, based on this, Ukraine is clearly not in a position where it should be thinking about joining the EU. It needs to sort out these deep-rooted problems, and some of them are kind of organizational, institutional, cultural problems which have gone back for decades, and they need to be rooted out and stopped. Things like endemic corruption, for example. And it might take Ukraine a very, very long time to tackle them, and it needs to be done before they come to the table and say, we're going to become members of the EU. Lastly, the economic impact of Ukraine joining the European Union would be absolutely dire. Ukraine is an extremely poor country. I think the GDP per capita of Ukraine is approximately half the level of the poorest current EU member, which would be Bulgaria. And it's not going up as the war continues. Things are getting worse and worse, and the distance between the standard of living in the EU and the standard of living in Ukraine is declining. They're diverging. So if we introduce a very, very poor country like Ukraine with a comparatively large population of at least 38 million people into the European Union, what kind of effects would that have? Well, first of all, Ukraine is at war, and we've seen enormous destruction wreaked in Ukraine. The estimate for rebuilding Ukraine after the war is finished is in excess of $1 trillion. Where is that money going to come from? It is a country that has seen cities destroyed, mass infrastructure destruction for things like the electricity delivery infrastructure, bridges, roads, dams. It's just utterly vast, the scale of the destruction. It's all going to need to be rebuilt. It's basically going to necessitate a massive economic effort on the scale of the post-World War II Marshall Plan. And the question is, who is going to pay for that? If Donald Trump gets into office in the US, for sure it's not going to be the United States. So will the burden for this fall on the European Union partners? Well, if Ukraine joins the European Union, I think the answer to that question is probably yes. Right now in the EU, a key element of the budget is the idea that EU money should be used to fund improvements in countries that will allow them to come up to the EU average income. The average income level in Ukraine is massively lower than the EU average, and what that will mean is that if Ukraine joins the EU, we will see a wealth transfer from the existing EU countries towards the new member state of Ukraine and potentially others as well. I actually found a table produced by the Brookings Institute which examines the situation where Ukraine and several other nations join the European Union. And you can see the effect that it will have on the budget of the EU that's allocated both now and after the accession of these countries. What will happen is that many countries go from being net receivers of aid to receiving basically nothing at all. They actually become net donors. Whereas other countries, like for example Portugal, which presently receives 5.1% of EU funds, will see this diminish rapidly and massively to only 1.1%. So an 80% cut in the EU funds received by Portugal, and many other countries are in a similar position. Poland also likely to see a massive reduction in the amount of EU funds received. Greece, Lithuania, Estonia, every single country in the EU that presently receives EU aid, like if you take a country like Spain that receives 9.6% of the present EU budget, it's going to plunge to a very low level, if not zero. Whereas in contrast, Ukraine and the other candidate countries that are entering into the bloc, they're going to receive far more in aid simply because they have far lower economic levels compared to the average level of the EU. I think it's also worthy of noting that the other candidate countries, like for example Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, even Moldova or Northern Macedonia, they have populations which are significantly smaller than Ukraine. Together, all of these other potential member states in the Western Balkans have approximately 25 million people, which is significantly less than the population of Ukraine alone. And they are richer than the Ukrainians as well. The economic conditions in those countries are better and therefore would represent less of a burden for the EU. It would be far easier for the EU to integrate the Western Balkan countries into the EU without Ukraine. But I think it would be extremely difficult, stressful and financially disastrous to try to integrate the Western Balkan nations and Ukraine simultaneously, or even to integrate Ukraine on its own. Added to this, there are already objections to Ukrainian membership basically coming out of Eastern Europe. When the war started, Ukraine was allowed to send grain and other agricultural products into the EU without any kind of tariff or control. And the Eastern European countries like Poland were up in arms about this because they correctly see that it will undermine their agricultural industry. So there are these kind of conflicts existing, and we have to think about what can we really gain from Ukrainian membership of the EU. Yes, they have an agricultural sector, but what else do they have? They don't have a significant industrial sector. And what they have is a lot of damaged infrastructure that needs to be repaired, and they need somebody to pay for it. And if they join the EU, that's going to be us. Ukraine also doesn't have significant natural resources. I mean, they have some, but apart from agriculture, nothing special. They're dependent on energy on Russia, just as the EU has been for many, many decades, and we're coming out of that now. Ukraine also has a very, very poor demographic situation. Well before the war, the population had been in decline. You have an aging population, a lot of emigration, a very, very low birth rate. In 2020, the fertility rate in Ukraine was only 1.22 live births per woman, which is well below the replacement rate. You have to remember, Eastern Europe is not a place which is receiving waves of migrants, going in. That's more of a Western European situation. So the birth rate is chronically low. There's an aging population. There's massive war damage, and there's extreme poverty. All of these things are basically creating a kind of poisonous cocktail in Ukraine. And if they're permitted to join the EU, people have to pay for that. That has to be paid for somehow, and it's going to come out of EU coffers. Basically, those countries who've been receiving a lot of EU funds presently are no longer going to be in a position where they're going to be receiving those funds, and it's going to be directed into Ukraine, into rebuilding Ukraine for all the war damage and things like that. And basically, rebuilding Ukraine is going to become like Europe's burden, and it's a burden that could last for decades and would just be financially ruinous for the other members. So I think it's something which we have to consider extremely carefully before we just plunge into this. Yes, it's unfortunate that Ukraine was invaded by Russia. Yes, we should probably support Ukraine in their struggle against Russia, but that needn't extend to granting them membership of the EU, because to do so would place such a huge financial burden on the EU while giving us next to no benefits. I mean, what benefits are we really going to get from Ukrainian membership? Maybe Western European countries can receive some young Ukrainians who might want to come and work in the labour force. I think that's already done. It's already there. Many of them came during the war as refugees, and they're already integrated into societies in Germany, France, the UK, that's outside the EU, Spain, Portugal. They're already here. I think there's limited additional benefit from the EU side, from the EU perspective, to including Ukraine in the organisation. I think we fundamentally need to guard against massive gestures of political goodwill and sympathy. We cannot allow our emotions to drive us into an economic black hole. And in conclusion, I think that if Ukraine was allowed to join the EU, it would be hugely unfair to other candidate countries who've been waiting for far longer and made better progress. Dangerous from a defence perspective, bearing in mind Article 42.7 of the European Treaty. Complicated because EU institutions would also require reform, and there would be a lot of problems dealing with things like qualified majority voting. And lastly, economically ruinous. Very few economic advantages in bringing Ukraine into the Union, and a lot of negatives associated with rebuilding the country and just trying to improve the general level of poverty which is found there currently. So my answer is clear and unequivocal. Ukraine should not be joining the EU, and they should not be a candidate country for joining the EU in 2024. And to be honest, I think the prospects of Ukraine realistically being allowed to join the European Union based on any kind of reasonable criteria are zero. It can't happen. If it does happen, it's a political decision, and it's a wrong-headed decision, and it's something which is going to cause economic misery across the European Union and will be a profound source of regret. Alright, well, I hope people found this video entertaining and useful. I certainly enjoyed making it, and I will see you soon in the next one.